Captain Jake Martinez stared at the strange ships that had just appeared on his scanner and felt his heart sink into his stomach because these were not human ships, and they were massive beyond anything Earth had ever built, and they moved with a grace that spoke of technology far beyond what humanity possessed. And Jake knew that first contact was not going the way anyone had hoped it would go. The USS Liberty had been exploring the outer rim of what humans called the Kepler system when the alien vessels materialized from what looked like tears in space itself, and Jake watched his communications officer, Lieutenant Grace Murphy, try to establish contact, while his weapons officer, Lieutenant Ben Carter, kept his hands hovering over the firing controls. Even though Jake knew their small exploration ship would be like a mosquito attacking an elephant. The alien response came in perfect English, which somehow made everything worse because it meant they had been watching humanity for a long time, and the voice that spoke through the communication system was cold and mechanical and carried the weight of absolute authority when it said that Captain Martinez and his crew were now prisoners of the Galactic Sovereignty Council and would be taken to their homeworld for processing. Jake tried to argue and tried to explain that humanity was peaceful and just exploring. But the alien voice cut him off and told him that all species said the same thing when they were caught, expanding beyond their assigned territories, and that the Council had been dealing with upstart races for over 2,000 years and knew exactly how to handle the situation. The alien ship surrounded the Liberty with ease, and Jake watched helplessly as some kind of energy beam locked onto his ship and began pulling it toward the largest of the alien vessels, and he ordered his crew to prepare for boarding while Grace sent out an emergency transmission to Earth, even though Jake knew it would take months to reach home through normal space. The boarding happened quickly and efficiently, with tall gray aliens in elaborate armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal, and they moved through the Liberty like they owned it and rounded up Jake and his crew without any violence, because resistance was clearly pointless, and Jake found himself face to face with what was obviously their leader. The alien introduced itself as Ambassador Velthar of the Zephyrian Empire and explained that Jake and his crew were fortunate because they would be allowed to carry a message back to their homeworld, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine because the way Velthar said it made it clear that this was not good news for humanity. Velthar led Jake to a viewing chamber where the alien showed him images of other worlds and other species that had once been free and independent, but were now part of the Council's empire, and Jake saw beings that looked like they had once been proud and strong, now working in mines and factories and serving their alien masters, and Velthar explained that this was the natural order of things in the galaxy. The ambassador told Jake that humanity had been watched since they first achieved nuclear weapons, and that the Council had been debating what to do about them for decades, and that some members wanted to eliminate humanity entirely before they could become a threat, but others argued that humans might be useful as laborers and soldiers if properly trained and controlled. Jake listened with growing horror as Velthar explained that the Council had decided to offer humanity a choice, and that this was more generous than most species received, and that Earth could surrender voluntarily and accept Council authority or face what the ambassador called corrective measures, which Jake understood meant total destruction. The terms of surrender were simple and brutal, and Jake memorized every word because he knew he would need to repeat them exactly when he returned to Earth, and the Council demanded that humanity accept technological limitations that would prevent them from developing advanced weapons or faster-than-light travel beyond what the Council approved. They also demanded tribute in the form of natural resources, including rare metals and energy sources, and most horrifying of all, they wanted a percentage of the human population to serve as workers and soldiers in the Council's continuing expansion across the galaxy. And Velthar made it clear that these humans would never return to Earth. Jake asked why the Council was doing this, and Velthar seemed genuinely puzzled by the question and explained that strong species naturally dominated weak ones, and that this had been the way of the galaxy for millennia, and that humanity should be grateful to be offered any choice at all instead of simply being exterminated. The ambassador showed Jake recordings of Council fleets in action, and Jake watched in sick fascination as alien warships destroyed entire cities with single shots and turned populated worlds into lifeless rocks in a matter of hours. And Velthar explained that this was what happened to species that refused the Council's generous offer. Jake was returned to his ship along with his crew and told that they had 30 Earth days to deliver the Council's message and return with their planet's answer, and Velthar warned that any attempt to flee or hide would result in immediate punishment, and that the Council had ways of tracking human ships that Jake could not imagine. The Liberty was released, and Jake immediately set course for Earth while Grace worked on strengthening their emergency transmission, and Jake knew that even at maximum speed, they would barely make it home in time, and that every hour counted because humanity needed to know what was coming. Admiral Lisa Brooks received the transmission at Luna Station 3 weeks before the Liberty was scheduled to arrive, and she felt the blood drain from her face as she listened to Grace Murphy's report about massive alien ships and ultimatums and demands for surrender, and she immediately contacted Earth's leadership. President Sam Johnson was in a cabinet meeting when Admiral Brooks called, and he listened to the recording twice before asking everyone else to leave the room, and then he sat in silence for a full minute before calling an emergency session of the Global Defense Council because he knew that humanity was facing its greatest crisis. Dr. Ryan Clark was pulled out of his xenobiology lab and rushed to Luna Station, where Admiral Brooks played him the transmission and asked for his professional opinion, and Ryan listened carefully before explaining that everything about the alien behavior suggested a highly advanced civilization that was used to getting its way without serious resistance. General Kate Adams arrived at Luna Station 6 hours later, and after hearing the transmission, she immediately began calculating Earth's defensive capabilities, and the numbers were not encouraging because humanity had been focused on exploration and colonization rather than military development, and their weapons were designed for use against other humans. Not advanced alien technology. Secretary of State Paul Rivera tried to find diplomatic solutions and suggested that perhaps humanity could negotiate better terms or find some way to appease the Council without completely surrendering their freedom. But Admiral Brooks pointed out that the aliens had made it clear this was not a negotiation, but an ultimatum. Jake Martinez and the Liberty crew arrived at Earth exactly 29 days after their encounter with the Council fleet, and Jake was immediately brought to Luna Station, where he repeated Velthar's message word for word to the assembled leadership and answered hundreds of questions about alien technology and capabilities and intentions. The debate that followed lasted 18 hours. And President Johnson listened to every argument about surrender and resistance and diplomatic solutions and military preparations, and when it was over, he stood up and looked each person in the eye before making the decision that would determine humanity's fate. President Johnson activated the Global Communication Network and addressed not just Earth's leaders but every human being in the solar system, and he told them about the alien ultimatum and the choice they faced, and then he said the words that would echo through history when he declared that Earth would never kneel to anyone, and that if the aliens wanted their world, they would have to take it by force. The transmission went out across the galaxy on every frequency. Humanity could access, and Jake Martinez watched from Luna Station as President Johnson's words reached not just the Council, but every species in their empire, and Jake wondered if humanity had just signed its death warrant or declared its independence from a tyranny that had ruled the galaxy for far too long. The response from the Galactic Sovereignty Council came exactly 12 hours after President Johnson's defiant broadcast, and Ambassador Velthar's image appeared on every screen across human space with an expression that might have been amusement. If Jake Martinez had been better at reading alien faces, and the ambassador's words carried the weight of absolute certainty when he said that humanity had chosen extinction over wisdom, Velthar explained that in 2,000 years of council expansion, no species had ever refused their generous offer twice, and that most civilizations begged for mercy long before reaching this point. And he seemed genuinely curious about what made humans think they could succeed where countless others had failed. And he promised that humanity's destruction would serve as an educational example for other upstart races. President Johnson called another emergency meeting. But this time, the tone was different, because the choice had been made, and now the only question was how to fight an enemy that possessed technology centuries ahead of Earth's best efforts, and General Kate Adams laid out the brutal mathematics of the situation with calm professionalism. Earth's entire space fleet consisted of 47 ships designed for exploration and colonization, with minimal weapons and no real armor, and the largest was barely 300 meters long, while the smallest council ship Jake had seen was over a kilometer, and Admiral Lisa Brooks estimated that humanity was outnumbered by at least 100 to 1 in terms of actual combat capability. Dr. Ryan Clark had spent every waking hour since the Liberty's return, analyzing the sensor data and alien technology samples that Jake's crew had managed to collect, and his conclusions were sobering because the Council's weapons operated on principles that human science barely understood, and their defensive systems seemed to violate several laws of physics. Colonel Danny Wright was pulled from his position overseeing Earth's nuclear weapons program and given unlimited resources to develop what President Johnson called Project Hellfire. And Danny understood that his job was to find ways to hurt an enemy that considered humanity's best weapons. To be primitive, Toys Dr. Amy Foster led the team trying to reverse engineer the small alien devices that the Liberty crew had smuggled back, and she worked 18-hour days trying to understand technology that seemed to operate more like magic than science, and every breakthrough only revealed how much more humanity didn't know. The industrial capacity of every human world was converted to military production, and asteroid mining operations were expanded to provide the raw materials needed for weapons that existed only in theoretical form, and Admiral Brooks coordinated the largest construction project in human history as orbital shipyards worked around the clock to build anything that might slow down the coming invasion. Captain Tony Blake took command of the defensive satellite network that was being constructed around Earth, and he knew that the platforms he was building would probably last only minutes against Council weapons, but minutes might be enough to get off. A few shots, and every shot that connected was one more than the Council expected to face. Major Susan Lee trained the first generation of human space marines in combat techniques that had never been tested because no human had ever fought aliens before. And she developed tactics based on what Jake Martinez had observed about alien behavior and the assumption that close-quarters combat might be humanity's only advantage. The moon became an armed fortress with weapons emplacements and manufacturing. facilities buried deep beneath its surface, and Mars colonies were converted into supply bases, while the asteroid belt was seeded with automated weapons platforms and sensor networks that would give Earth advance warning of the Council's approach. Dr. Foster's breakthrough came 6 weeks into the preparation period, when she finally managed to activate one of the alien communication devices and discovered that human computer systems could interface with Council technology in ways that the aliens had never anticipated, and she realized that humanity's chaotic approach to programming might actually be an advantage. Colonel Wright's Project Hellfire produced weapons that horrified even their creators, because Danny had taken humanity's nuclear arsenal and combined it with theoretical physics and alien technology to create devices that could crack asteroids and turn space itself into a weapon, and he knew that using them would probably contaminate human space for centuries. The first test of human-alien hybrid technology took place in the outer solar system, and Jake Martinez watched from the observation deck of the USS Liberty as a prototype weapon turned a small asteroid into plasma and energy readings that made no sense, according to human science. And he began to believe that humanity might actually have a chance. President Johnson toured the construction sites and weapons testing facilities and spoke with workers and soldiers who knew they were probably going to die, but kept building and training anyway, and he saw something in their faces that he had never seen before, which was the look of people who had chosen to fight rather than surrender, no matter what the cost. The deadline given by the Council was now only days away, and long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures moving toward human space, and Admiral Brooks knew that the demonstration fleet that Velthar had promised was finally coming, and she gave the order for all human forces to assume battle positions. Jake Martinez was given command of a squadron of converted civilian ships that had been armed with the most advanced weapons humanity could produce, and he looked at his small fleet and thought about the massive Council ships he had seen and wondered if courage would be enough when courage was all they had. The Council's demonstration fleet dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter exactly on schedule, and sensor readings showed 50 ships each larger than anything in human space, and they moved in perfect formation toward Earth, with the casual confidence of predators approaching helpless prey, and Admiral Brooks watched them come and gave the order that would change everything, every human ship and station and weapons. Platform received the same message at the same time, and Admiral Brooks spoke the words that would echo through galactic history when she said that all units were authorized to execute Pandora Protocol, and that humanity would show the galaxy what happened when you threatened Earth. The alien fleet continued its approach toward Earth with no apparent concern for the small human ships moving to intercept them, and Jake Martinez led his squadron toward enemies that outgunned him by orders of magnitude. And he thought about his crew and his planet and the choice between freedom and slavery, and he armed every weapon his ship carried. Dr. Foster's computer viruses went active as soon as the first Council ship came within range, and alien systems that had operated flawlessly for centuries suddenly began experiencing errors and malfunctions that their designers had never anticipated, and Grace Murphy led cyber warfare teams that turned captured alien technology against its creators. Colonel Wright's Hellfire weapons fired for the first time in actual combat, and space itself seemed to scream as exotic matter warheads tore holes in reality and turned Council ships into expanding clouds of superheated plasma, and the aliens discovered that humanity had learned to weaponize their own destruction. The Battle of Jupiter lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, every Council ship was either destroyed or crippled, and Jake Martinez found himself staring at wreckage that represented technology. older than human civilization, and he realized that his species had just accomplished something that the aliens had believed was impossible. Admiral Brooks sent a message to the Galactic Sovereignty Council, and her words were broadcast across every frequency humanity could access, and she told them that this was what happened when you threatened Earth, and that humanity was not their cattle and would never be their slaves, and that any force sent against human space would meet the same fate. The galaxy listened to Admiral Brooks's message, and for the first time in 2,000 years, the Galactic Sovereignty Council faced an enemy that had not only refused to surrender, but had actually destroyed their forces, and across the empire enslaved. Species began to whisper about the small blue world that had chosen to fight, rather than Neil Velthar received the report of his demonstration fleet's destruction with something that might have been shock if aliens felt such things. And he realized that humanity represented something new and dangerous in the galaxy, and he began to understand that this war would not end quickly or easily, and that the Council might have awakened something that they could not control. The news of the demonstration fleet's complete destruction spread through Council space like wildfire, and for the first time in millennia, species that had accepted their place as servants and slaves began to ask questions about the small blue world that had dared to fight back, and Velthar found himself facing something he had never encountered before, which was doubt about the Council's absolute power. Captain Ben Carter led the salvage operations in the wreckage field near Jupiter, and what his teams found changed everything humanity thought they knew about their enemies, because the alien ships were not just technologically advanced, but were also incredibly old, with some components dating back over 1,500 years, and the aliens had become complacent about their superiority. Dr. Amy Foster worked around the clock to analyze the captured alien technology, and what she discovered made her hands shake with excitement, because Council systems were designed around the assumption that no enemy would ever use chaotic, unpredictable tactics, and their defensive programming could not adapt to the random nature of human-computer viruses. Jake Martinez was promoted to Admiral and given command of humanity's first Deep Strike Force, because President Johnson had decided that waiting for the next Council attack was not enough, and that humanity needed to take the fight to their enemies and show the galaxy that the Council could be beaten anywhere and everywhere. The intelligence gathered from captured Council ships revealed the location of their nearest military base, and Admiral Brooks approved Jake's plan for a surprise attack, even though it meant sending human ships deep into enemy territory with no possibility of retreat or rescue if things went wrong. But Jake argued that humanity needed to prove they could project force beyond their own solar system. Colonel Danny Wright's Project Hellfire had evolved beyond simple weapons into something that terrified even its creators, because Danny had learned to weaponize fundamental forces, and his latest creation could destabilize the nuclear fusion process that powered alien ships and turn their own energy sources against them. Dr. Ryan Clark's xenobiological research had revealed crucial weaknesses in Council species, because most of them had evolved as prey animals or cooperative hive minds, and had never developed the individual aggression and unpredictability that made humans such effective warriors. And this gave humanity a psychological advantage that the aliens could not understand. Major Susan Lee's Space Marines had been training in captured alien armor and weapons, and had developed boarding tactics that exploited the fact that Council ships were designed around the assumption that their crews would never face hand-to-hand combat, and the aliens were physically unprepared for human aggression. The first human deep strike mission launched from Luna Station with Jake Martinez commanding a fleet of 12 ships that had been stripped of everything non-essential and loaded with the most destructive weapons humanity could produce. And Grace Murphy led the cyber warfare team that would attempt to capture alien communication networks. Target was a Council supply depot in the Proxima system that supported military operations across 3 sectors, and the base was defended by 20 ships and an orbital defense grid that the aliens considered impregnable, and Jake knew that his small force would need to achieve total surprise to have any chance of success. The human fleet used captured alien hyperspace technology to jump directly into the heart of the enemy system, and Jake watched his tactical display light up with hostile contacts as the Council forces scrambled to respond to an attack they had never imagined possible, and he gave the order to engage immediately. Danny Wright's Hellfire weapons struck first, and 3 Council ships simply ceased to exist as their fusion cores were destabilized and turned into miniature supernovas, and the remaining alien ships found themselves facing weapons that operated on principles their designers had never considered, and their shields and armor provided no protection. Grace Murphy's cyber attack penetrated the base's communication system and began broadcasting human propaganda to every Council facility within range, and across the galaxy enslaved species heard Jake Martinez's voice declaring that the Council's reign of terror was ending and that freedom was possible for any species brave enough to fight. The battle lasted only 40 minutes, and when it was over, the Council base was an expanding cloud of debris, and Jake's fleet had captured enough alien technology and intelligence to keep human scientists busy for years. And most importantly, they had proven that the Council could be defeated anywhere in the galaxy. The response from Council leadership was swift and brutal, and Velthar authorized the mobilization of the full invasion fleet, which consisted of over 3,000 ships, representing the combined military might of 12 civilizations, and he declared that humanity would be made an example of that would terrorize the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. President Johnson received intelligence about the Council's military buildup from captured alien databases, and he called an emergency session of the Global Defense Council because humanity now faced a force that could sterilize every human world simultaneously, and conventional defensive strategies were meaningless against such overwhelming numbers. General Kate Adams proposed a strategy that she called the Scorched Galaxy Protocol, and her plan was simple and terrifying, because if humanity was going to die, then they would take as much of the Council empire with them as possible and turn their own destruction into a weapon that would inspire rebellion across the galaxy. Dr. Foster's team had developed quantum viruses that could spread through alien communication networks and cause system failures across entire sectors, and the viruses were designed to activate only after human forces were destroyed, ensuring that the Council's victory would be poisoned by the collapse of their own infrastructure. Colonel Wright unveiled his most devastating creation, which was a weapon that could destabilize stars and turn them into supernovas, and he had already identified 12 Council home systems that could be targeted simultaneously, and the destruction would eliminate billions of aliens and render vast regions of space uninhabitable. Admiral Brooks coordinated the placement of automated weapons platforms throughout human space and beyond, with each platform armed with Hellfire warheads and programmed to activate if communication with Earth was lost for more than 72 hours, and the galaxy would learn that humanity's death would trigger a chain reaction of destruction. Jake Martinez led reconnaissance missions deep into Council territory and discovered that several enslaved species were secretly providing intelligence and support to human forces, and the Council's empire was beginning to fracture as news of human victories spread and inspired resistance. movements on dozens of worlds. The most shocking discovery came when Jake's forces made contact with a group of alien refugees who had escaped from Council territory. And these beings revealed that humanity's example had already triggered uprisings on 17 worlds, and that the Council was facing internal rebellion for the first time in its history. Captain Tony Blake's orbital fortresses around Earth had been expanded into massive weapons platforms that could destroy approaching fleets, while Major Susan Lee's Marines prepared for urban warfare in Earth's cities, because everyone understood that the final battle would be fought in humanity's home system, regardless of how many aliens they killed first. Dr. Clark's research revealed that the Council's greatest weakness was their inability to understand species that chose death over slavery, and their entire military doctrine was based on the assumption that conquered peoples would accept defeat rather than fight to extinction, and humanity's refusal to surrender was literally incomprehensible to them. The Council's invasion fleet began moving toward human space and long range. Sensors detected energy signatures that dwarfed anything humanity had ever imagined, and Admiral Brooks knew that the final battle was approaching, and she issued orders for the implementation of Operation Last Stand, which would turn Earth itself into a weapon. President Johnson addressed the human species one final time before the invasion. Fleet arrived, and he told them that they had already won, regardless of what happened next, because they had shown the galaxy that slavery was not inevitable, and that freedom was worth any price, and that their example would inspire resistance for generations to come. Velthar led the Council fleet personally, because he understood that humanity represented an existential threat to everything the Council had built, and he was determined to destroy them so completely that no other species would ever dare to follow their example, and he broadcast a message to Earth demanding immediate surrender. The human response was transmitted on every frequency in the galaxy, and Jake Martinez spoke for his entire species when he told the Council that humanity would never surrender and never kneel, and that they were welcome to try taking Earth by force and discover what happened when you threatened a world full of humans who had chosen to fight rather than live as slaves. The Council's main invasion fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of human territory like a plague of metal locusts, and Admiral Lisa Brooks watched her tactical displays light up with 3,000 enemy contacts, and she felt a cold satisfaction. Because humanity had been preparing for this moment, and the aliens were about to discover that humans learned quickly from their mistakes. Velthar commanded the fleet from his flagship, which was larger than most human cities, and he broadcast a final ultimatum to Earth, demanding immediate surrender and promising that quick submission would result in a relatively merciful occupation. But Admiral Brooks responded by activating every weapon system in human space simultaneously. The first wave of Hellfire missiles struck the Council vanguard before they could raise their shields, and Jake Martinez watched from his command ship as alien vessels that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries simply vanished in bursts of exotic radiation. And he realized that humanity's desperate gamble was actually working. Dr. Amy Foster's quantum viruses had been preloaded into captured Council communication systems, and as soon as the invasion fleet tried to coordinate their attack, the viruses activated and began spreading through their networks like digital cancer, and alien ships found their own computers turning against them. Colonel Danny Wright's stellar bombs had been positioned throughout the outer solar system, and when the Council fleet moved into attack formation, they triggered automatically and turned local space into a maze of gravitational anomalies and radiation storms that disrupted alien sensors and navigation systems. The Council forces adapted quickly because they had not survived for 2 millennia by being inflexible, and Velthar ordered his ships to disperse and attack human positions individually rather than maintaining formation. But this played directly into Admiral Brooks's strategy because isolated, alien ships were vulnerable to boarding actions. Major Susan Lee's Space Marines launched from hidden asteroid bases and used captured alien technology to board Council ships in the middle of combat. And the aliens discovered that humans could fight, effectively in zero-gravity and toxic atmospheres, and showed no fear of death when their homes were threatened. Captain Ben Carter led fighter squadrons armed with Hellfire torpedoes against the largest Council ships, and his pilots flew attack. Patterns that the aliens could not predict, because human tactics were based on chaos and improvisation rather than rigid doctrine, and the Council's defensive systems could not adapt fast enough. The battle raged for 6 days and nights across the entire solar system, and Jake Martinez found himself fighting running battles from Mercury to Pluto as human forces used hit-and-run tactics to slowly bleed the massive Council fleet, and every human ship destroyed took dozens of alien vessels. With them, Dr. Ryan Clark's xenobiological weapons proved devastatingly effective because the Council had never encountered diseases designed specifically to target their immune systems, and several alien species found their ships becoming death traps as human bioweapons spread through their life support systems. Grace Murphy's cyber warfare teams had gained access to the Council's tactical networks and began feeding false information to alien commanders while simultaneously broadcasting human propaganda to enslaved species throughout the galaxy, and the Council found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts. The turning point came when Captain Tony Blake's orbital fortresses around Earth revealed their true purpose and opened fire with weapons that could crack moons, and the Council fleet discovered that humanity had turned their own planet into the ultimate fortress with firepower that exceeded anything in their experience. Velthar watched his supposedly invincible fleet being systematically destroyed by a species that should have been primitive savages, and he began to understand that the Council had made a fundamental error in assuming that technological superiority guaranteed victory against an enemy, willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. The most shocking moment came when Jake Martinez led a boarding party onto Velthar's flagship itself, and the alien commander found himself face-to-face with a human who spoke perfect Council standard, and told him that humanity had been studying alien psychology and had learned exactly how to break species that had never faced real resistance. Admiral Brooks received reports from across the galaxy that enslaved species were rising in rebellion and using tactics copied from human resistance broadcasts, and the Council found themselves fighting wars on dozens of fronts simultaneously as their empire began to collapse from within. The alien fleet that had seemed so massive and unstoppable was reduced to scattered survivors within 2 weeks, and Velthar himself was captured when his flagship was boarded by Major Lee's Marines, and he became the first Council ambassador to ever surrender to a species they had tried to conquer. President Johnson addressed the galaxy from the ruins of the Council fleet, and his words were broadcast to every world in known space when he declared that the age of slavery was ending, and that any species willing to fight for freedom would find humanity. Standing beside them, Dr. Foster's analysis of captured Council technology revealed the locations of slave camps and military bases throughout the galaxy, and Jake Martinez led liberation fleets to dozens of worlds where humans fought alongside alien resistance movements to overthrow their oppressors. The Council's remaining leadership tried to maintain control by threatening to destroy rebel worlds, but they discovered that their own military commanders were beginning to question orders to commit genocide, and several alien species within the Council itself began demanding an end to the war. Colonel Wright's stellar weapons had been positioned near major Council worlds, and the threat of mutual annihilation forced the alien leadership to accept that they could no longer simply crush resistance through overwhelming force, because humanity had proven that some species would rather die than submit. The war spread beyond military conflict into economic and political upheaval as trade routes were disrupted and colonial administrations collapsed, and the Council discovered that their empire had been built on fear rather than loyalty, and that fear could work both ways. Captain Carter led deep strike missions against Council infrastructure, and his forces destroyed shipyards and weapons factories while carefully avoiding civilian populations, because humanity understood that winning the war meant convincing the galaxy that they offered liberation rather than conquest. The most significant victory came when an entire Council species called the Altarians declared independence and joined the human alliance, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Council military capabilities and the locations of hidden bases and weapon stockpiles. Major Lee's Marines became legendary throughout the galaxy for their willingness to fight hopeless battles to protect civilian populations, and alien refugees began fleeing to human-controlled space because they knew that humans would die rather than abandon those who sought freedom. The Council's economy began to collapse as slave labor became unreliable and rebellions disrupted production, and Velthar realized from his prison cell that the humans had not just defeated the Council military, but had destroyed the foundations of their entire civilization. Dr. Clark's research into Council psychology revealed that most of the ruling species had never experienced real defeat and were psychologically unprepared for the possibility that their empire could actually fall. And this mental fragility accelerated the collapse as alien leaders began abandoning their posts. Admiral Brooks coordinated liberation efforts across hundreds of star systems while simultaneously preparing for the Council's final desperate gambit, which intelligence suggested would involve attempting to destroy human space, even if it meant triggering a galactic civil war. Jake Martinez established contact with resistance movements on the Council homeworlds themselves, and discovered that even the ruling species contained individuals who opposed the Empire's brutal policies and were willing to work toward a more just galactic order. The war reached a critical point when the Council's remaining forces gathered for a final assault on Earth itself, and Velthar was released from prison to carry an ultimatum from his desperate government offering to negotiate a peace treaty that would preserve some form of Council authority. President Johnson's response was broadcast to every world in the galaxy when he declared that there would be no negotiation with slavers and no peace until every sentient being in the galaxy was free to determine their own destiny, and that humanity would accept nothing less than the complete dissolution of the Council. The final battle was approaching, and both sides knew that the outcome would determine whether the galaxy would continue under the Council's tyrannical rule or enter a new age of freedom and cooperation based on the principles that humanity had been willing to die to defend. The Council's final armada, assembled at the edge of human space, was the largest military force ever gathered in galactic history and consisted of every remaining ship from 12 different civilizations, along with conscripted vessels from enslaved species, and Velthar commanded this desperate fleet, with the knowledge that failure would mean the end of everything his people had built over 2 millennia. Admiral Lisa Brooks watched the enemy fleet approach Earth and felt a grim satisfaction. because humanity had spent months preparing for this moment, and the aliens were about to discover that humans had turned their own solar system into the galaxy's largest weapon, and every asteroid and moon had been converted into a fortress bristling with hellfire armaments. Jake Martinez led the human fleet in a final desperate gambit that involved using captured Council hyperspace technology to position human ships inside the enemy formation, and his crews knew they were probably going to die, but they also knew that every alien ship they destroyed would never threaten another world. Dr. Amy Foster's quantum viruses had evolved beyond simple computer programs into something approaching artificial intelligence, and they spread through the Council fleet's communication networks like living things, and began systematically shutting down alien systems faster than their technicians could repair them. The battle began when Colonel Danny Wright's stellar bombs detonated simultaneously throughout the outer solar system and turned local space into a maze of gravitational anomalies and radiation storms that made conventional tactics impossible and forced both fleets to fight at close range, where human advantages were most pronounced. Captain Ben Carter's fighter squadrons emerged from hidden bases throughout the asteroid belt and attacked the Council fleet from every direction, simultaneously using hellfire torpedoes that could penetrate alien shields and armor, and his pilots flew with the desperate courage of people defending their homes. Major Susan Lee's Space Marines boarded alien ships in the middle of the battle and fought hand-to-hand combat in corridors designed for species that had never expected to face human aggression. And the aliens discovered that humans could kill effectively with primitive weapons when advanced technology failed. The turning point came when Grace Murphy's cyber warfare teams gained control of the Council's tactical networks and began turning alien ships against each other while simultaneously broadcasting surrender offers to enslaved species serving in the Council fleet, and dozens of alien vessels simply stopped fighting. Velthar watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos as human tactics that made no logical sense somehow proved devastatingly effective, and he began to understand that his species had made a fundamental error in believing that superior technology could overcome superior motivation. The most terrifying moment for the Council forces came when they realized that humans had weaponized their own star, and that Earth's sun had been rigged with stellar bombs that could trigger a supernova that would destroy both fleets and sterilize dozens of nearby star systems. President Johnson's broadcast to the Council fleet was simple and direct when he told them that humanity would rather destroy the entire solar system than live as slaves, and that the choice was theirs, but they had exactly 1 hour to decide before the stellar bombs activated automatically. Admiral Brooks coordinated the final assault on the Council flagship, while Jake Martinez led boarding parties that fought their way through alien defenses that had been designed to repel armies, and the humans advanced room by room with a determination that the aliens found incomprehensible. The shock that ended the battle came not from human weapons, but from the Council fleet itself, when 3 entire alien species simultaneously declared independence and turned their ships against their former masters, and the Altarians led a rebellion that split the Council fleet in half. Captain Tony Blake's orbital fortresses around Earth revealed their ultimate capability when they opened portals directly into the Council flagship's command center and deposited armed Marines in the heart of alien leadership, and Velthar found himself facing human soldiers who had appeared from nowhere. Dr. Ryan Clark's xenobiological weapons had been designed specifically to incapacitate rather than kill and alien crews. Throughout the fleet, found themselves unable to fight as human bioweapons shut down their nervous systems and left them helpless but alive because humanity wanted prisoners, not corpses. The final surrender came when Velthar himself was captured and forced to broadcast an order for all Council forces to cease fighting and submit to human authority, and his words were transmitted to every ship in the fleet, and beyond, to every world in the galaxy. Jake Martinez stood on the bridge of the captured Council flagship and looked out at the wreckage of the most powerful military force in galactic history, and he realized that humanity had not just won a battle but had fundamentally changed the nature of galactic civilization. The aftermath of the battle saw liberation fleets spreading throughout the galaxy as human forces worked with alien resistance movements to overthrow Council administrators. And free enslaved populations, and everywhere they went, humans were greeted as liberators rather than conquerors. Dr. Foster's analysis of captured Council databases revealed the locations of every slave camp and military base in the galaxy, and liberation. Operations began immediately with human forces working alongside newly freed alien species to ensure that the Council's infrastructure of oppression was completely dismantled. President Johnson addressed the newly formed Galactic Liberation Council from Earth, and his words established the principles that would govern the new galactic order when he declared that every species had the right to determine its own destiny and that no being would ever again be forced to serve masters they did not choose. The Council's former homeworlds became the first members of the new Galactic Alliance, and their populations discovered that freedom meant responsibility as well as rights, and that building a just society required the same courage that winning the war had demanded. Colonel Wright's stellar weapons were systematically dismantled because humanity understood that weapons capable of destroying entire star systems had no place in a galaxy dedicated to peace and freedom, and the technology was shared with allied species for purely defensive purposes. Major Lee established training programs for alien resistance fighters, and her techniques spread throughout the galaxy as newly liberated species learned to defend themselves against any future attempts at conquest, and the principles of human military doctrine became the foundation for galactic defense. The most significant change came when former Council species began working together as equals rather than masters and slaves. And the Zephyrians, who had once ruled the Empire, became some of humanity's strongest allies in building the new galactic civilization. Admiral Brooks was elected as the first commander of the Galactic Alliance fleet, and she established policies that ensured military force would only be used to protect freedom rather than impose the will of the strong upon the weak, and every member species contributed to collective defense. Jake Martinez became humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Alliance, and he worked tirelessly to establish trade agreements and cultural exchanges that would bind the galaxy together through cooperation rather than conquest, and his efforts laid the foundation for lasting peace. The transformation of galactic civilization took decades to complete, but the principles established during humanity's war against the Council became the cornerstone of a new age, and species that had been enemies for millennia learned to work together toward common goals. Dr. Clark's research into comparative psychology helped different species understand each other and overcome the prejudices that the Council had encouraged, and his work became the basis for the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights that guaranteed freedom and dignity for all intelligent life. The final vindication of humanity's struggle came when the last Council slave camp was liberated, and the prisoners included members of species that had been enslaved for over 1,000 years and had never known freedom, and their tears of joy proved that the war had been worth every sacrifice. President Johnson's final address to the galaxy came on the 10th anniversary of the war's end, when he stood before representatives of over 300 species and told them that humanity had never wanted to be conquerors, but had always been willing to fight for the principle that freedom was the birthright of every thinking being. The legacy of the war lived on in the motto of the Galactic Alliance, which was taken from Admiral Brooke's final message to the Council fleet when she had declared that some species would rather burn the universe down than live on their knees, and that freedom was worth any price. Velthar spent his remaining years writing memoirs that became required reading throughout the galaxy, and his analysis of humanity's victory concluded that the Council had fallen not because humans were stronger or smarter, but because they alone among galactic species had been willing to choose death over slavery. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of the Council was not perfect, and conflicts still arose between species and worlds, but they were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than conquest and slavery, and the example of humanity's sacrifice ensured that freedom remained the highest value of galactic civilization.